Buonasera da Francesco De Leo, sono responsabile della comunicazione dell'Istituto Affari Internazionali, vi parlo dall'ambasciata di Francia a Roma, Palazzo Farnese, vi do il benvenuto ad un altro appuntamento di Conversazioni internazionali, un evento che lo IAI dedica in qualche modo ai giovani che con domande dirette riescono poi ad interagire con esponenti autorevoli del mondo delle relazioni internazionali. Oggi il nostro ospite è particolarmente autorevole, il presidente Nelli Feroci lo introduce e vi dà anche un saluto iniziale. Presidente.
Grazie Francesco. Prima di tutto vorrei salutare il segretario di Stato alle politiche europee francese Clément Beaune, lo vorrei soprattutto ringraziare e con lui vorrei ringraziare l'ambasciatore Massé per averci offerto questa opportunità all'Istituto, ma soprattutto ai giovani che oggi lo interrogheranno, di un colloquio diretto con gli esponenti di punta del governo francese sulle politiche europee. Il tema della conversazione di oggi è quello della posizione della Francia rispetto alle sfide dell'attualità europea, ma anche direi implicitamente anche il tema delle possibili convergenze tra Francia e Italia sui punti più qualificanti dell'agenda europea. Io ho avuto il piacere e la fortuna di conoscere Clément Beaune quando non era ancora segretario di Stato, era un stretto collaboratore del presidente Macron, cosa che è tuttora, e quindi la sua voce è una voce particolarmente autorevole. Oggi direi che Francia e Italia sono entrambe purtroppo impegnate in una sfida drammatica che è quella del contenimento dei contagi, dello sviluppo e attuazione di un piano di vaccini quanto più rapido ed efficace possibile. Ma non c'è solo questo nell'agenda dei due governi, c'è sicuramente un impegno comune ad intensificare la collaborazione bilaterale tra Francia e Italia per realizzare l'obiettivo di un'Unione Europea più solidale, più democratica, più efficace, più capace di corrispondere alle aspettative dei cittadini europei e anche in qualche modo più protagonista sulla scena europea. So che il ministro Beaune, il segretario di Stato Beaune, ha avuto oggi una serie di incontri importanti a Roma e i temi sul tappeto sono molti, sono numerosi, a parte quello della lotta alla pandemia. Sicuramente una delle cose più importanti sarà quella di garantire il successo del Next Generation EU. Oggi entrambi i paesi, entrambi i governi sono impegnati nella definizione di un piano nazionale di recovery. In questi piani nazionali si andrà a giocare il successo di questo importantissimo programma comune di assistenza ai paesi colpiti dalla pandemia. Non c'è solo questo nell'agenda europea, c'è il Green Deal che rimane comunque una priorità, c'è l'agenda digitale, c'è il tema dello sviluppo di una sovranità europea tecnologica, se così posso dire. Più in prospettiva c'è il tema della riforma, della prosecuzione della riforma della governance dell'euro, la revisione del patto di stabilità sulla quale dovremo rapidamente confrontarci probabilmente entro la fine dell'anno e infine due temi che ricordo sono particolarmente cari al presidente Macron e alla Francia. Il primo è quello dell'autonomia strategica su cui si sta interrogando in Europa per vedere come dare sostanza e contenuto a questo ambizioso obiettivo e il secondo è un tema che fu sollevato per primo proprio dal presidente Macron, è l'idea di una grande conferenza sul futuro dell'Europa per la quale ora finalmente ci sono le condizioni per una sua partenza e su cui sarà utile ed importante ascoltare che cosa avrà da dirci il segretario di Stato. Io con questo chiudo, ho preferito parlare in italiano, ma so che questa è una serata all'insegna del multilinguismo e lascio la parola al ministro Beaune sapendo che lui si esprimerà in inglese, ma sicuro che voi tutti lo riuscirete a seguire senza problemi. Grazie mille ancora e buona presentazione.
Grazie Presidente. Allora, Clément Beaune, che è qui vicino, è segretario di Stato presso il Ministero dell'Europa e degli Affari Esteri, incaricato degli Affari Europei. A lui la parola. Grazie di esserci.
Grazie mille. Il mio italiano non è sufficiente bene per parlare italiano stasera, so I will switch to English, unfortunately. But thank you very much for organizing this event and this discussion. It's now a year after this whole COVID crisis started, and in Italy in particular, it started in a brutal manner, and all European countries were hit by this pandemic and this wave soon afterwards. But at this moment, I think it's also probably a good moment to reflect on Europe during the crisis and to try to open some perspective for Europe after the crisis, but maybe looking at what has been working well or bad in this extraordinary year, in a way. When we look briefly at the situation in the EU since March 2020, I think it's quite striking to see that when there were some elements, some tools in the EU toolbox to act and to react, we managed to do so, which was not a given, because we all have memories of the previous big crisis, or the previous big crisis in the EU at the European level, migration crisis, but also maybe a bit more comparable because it was also an economic crisis, a debt crisis, a decade before. We famously know, and President Draghi, who was in previous positions, phrased it very well in several speeches. Europe, the EU, acted clearly too little too late, as we now know. And in this crisis, in the economic area in particular, I think we drew lessons from this previous failure. And we built, it was not easy, but we managed to build, actually quite quickly, in a few weeks, a strong European response, a strong European reaction, based on solidarity, and if I may put it like that, based on innovation. We were able to overcome our own rules, our own taboos. It's quite striking because we are the 11th of March, exactly a year ago, I think it was, to be precise, 13th of March, the President of the Commission, President von der Leyen, said publicly, we will get rid for as long as we need. It was the famous whatever it takes adapted to the new crisis. We will suspend rules regarding budgets, the fiscal rules, regarding competition, state aid rules and so on, which was a huge step forward, I think, to react to a crisis. I don't want to be too long and to go through the whole episodes of this crisis, but nearly a year ago, after this first step, France and Italy initiated a debate, which was extremely tense and difficult at the beginning, about common debts, the famous Corona bonds, as we called them at the time, about a common recovery plan, which was totally new in everyone's mind at this time. We triggered this debate together, France and Italy. We accepted to have this political, democratic, open debate at the European level, and to go quickly to the achievement of the final result, we managed to get an agreement, unanimous agreement at 27 in the EU, which was quite unthinkable a few weeks before, in July 2020, on this famous 750 billion recovery plan. Now we have difficulties to fully implement, which is another story, but we decided this. And this, so I think we, as we sometimes say, we didn't miss this crisis as an opportunity to make Europe change and act or react. I could take other examples of areas in which the EU was active or reactive. But I want also to take the other side or the other examples, the other case. It's the areas in which the EU was not equipped with tools, with legal tools, with budget tools. Of course, health, because it's a health crisis initially, mainly. There was a very difficult EU response, coordinated response. Let's not forget, because it's also a lesson we should reflect on and draw for the future. All countries, including France, I must say, we were creating tensions with each other. There were good things. I think, for instance, France never decided to close the border with Italy. In a moment when, let's remember, in the first days, it was crazy. There were some people saying it's an Italian issue. Of course, it was not an Italian issue, but this was a thinking in many places, including in my country. We never went in that direction, but we had difficulties to export masks in other EU countries and so on. Now let's just move forward. That's what we do with the vaccine. I will get back to that because it's obviously not perfect. But at least the debate we have about exports, for instance, is about exporting outside the EU. No one is seriously saying we will keep the vaccines in one single EU country and deprive the other, the neighbor, of vaccines or sanitary response or solutions. But at the beginning, there was this huge tension because it was new and because there was no European framework to answer to this crisis, which I think is an interesting lesson, because when we don't have the ability to act as EU, when we have to entirely invent it, it's more difficult to find an efficient response. Health was a good example, masks and so on. Borders were a good example. It's a deeply European issue, of course. We have built Schengen, we have built freedom of movement and so on, but as soon as the crisis hits the whole continent, the reflex, the spontaneous position was to close. And there was no coordination framework to say, maybe we should not close borders, maybe we should cooperate, we should not treat the virus as an enemy from abroad, we should find cooperative solutions to make sure that our lives, economic lives, social lives, human lives are not too much impacted by the virus and the responses we organize and so on. But we didn't have this as well. So I just draw a first lesson, which is when the EU is able to do something, it's not always answering well, but at least, and in this crisis, I say it was a good example of, I would say, European success. We managed to find the common way and the common response. When we didn't have any EU tool, we failed, to be frank. We failed, but forever. Then we found other solutions. And I think, for instance, because I was mentioning it, that what we are doing, even if it's difficult, even if it's clearly not perfect, even if it's too slow with the vaccines, buying them together, trying not to fight each other on the vaccine. Let's imagine if now Italy would negotiate its own contracts for each vaccine, France would do the same, Germany the same, it would be a nightmare. And I think all the difficulties we have would not be reduced, they would be increased, obviously. Again, it doesn't mean that we don't have to improve the European framework itself, but I think we have built something which is protecting our unity and solidarity as much as we can in a difficult moment in this new phase of the crisis. I hope the final phase of the crisis. What I think we should reflect about for the post-crisis moment, which is probably the most interesting one, because we all want and are more and more impatient about moving forward, and public opinion is clear in France. I guess, I know it's the same in Italy, rightly so, want to get out of this, to get freedom, to get out physically. And we have to think what the EU should do, should prioritize, should be in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think it's vital, because if we don't correct the failures, improve the semi-successes, or build on the successes, we will miss not a crisis, but a nearer reconstruction to rebuild our EU. And I think it would be vital, because I'm convinced that there can be a strong EU in the next 10 years, but I'm also convinced it's not a given at all. Brexit was a surprise. We can revive other fragilities, other difficulties very soon. So we have to draw lessons from the crisis. And I think 2 key words are very important, building on what I just mentioned. solidarity for sure, for different reasons, because we know that everything we did together, I'm not being naive or kind of naive federalist European, I think it's true and it's a reality. What we did together in this crisis, which was not a national crisis, obviously, as we know, it's a global crisis and a European crisis, we did better. And I think we will need this solidarity again after the crisis to implement quickly our recovery plan, to make sure we repay the recovery plan together with common resources, to also propose a positive project to the youth, which I think will be crucial after this crisis, because it is a health crisis becoming an economic crisis. It will be necessarily, unfortunately, a social crisis afterwards. We will lose some jobs, some companies will disappear, some people will lose their job and money, will have difficulties. Young people will have gone through a crisis in an even more difficult situation than probably the rest of society, most of the rest of society, not being able to go to find a job, to go to university, to enter the labor market, and so on and so forth, or just to live, which is probably even more difficult when you're 20 than when you're older. So if we don't say the EU has something to propose to you, I think these people will just say, I don't care about Europe, or I don't like Europe, or I hate Europe. Even if in the end the vaccination campaign works, even if the recovery plan delivers, and so on, because it's abstract, I think, for a lot of people, to be frank, but especially for the young people. So I don't have, of course, the magic bullets, but I think if there is no funding of entrepreneurship, of apprenticeship, of university mobility across Europe more than today for the young people, if there is nothing tangible but you doing something for them, we will lose the young generation, the people around 20 tomorrow, and Europe for them will be something totally abstract or totally faint. To be frank, it is exactly what happened 10 to 12 years ago in a lot of countries, especially in the southern part of Europe. We know it here, even harder in Spain, probably even harder in Greece. We lost a generation. I don't want that we lose a generation again after the crisis. So solidarity will be key. And the other elements, not to be too long, I think, is sovereignty. As you mentioned, it's an element of President Macron's narrative, of the French government narrative, for sure, for a long time now, for 4 years at least. But we saw in the crisis how crucial it was. And its sovereignty is not just about foreign policy or about defense. It's not even only about new technologies like 5G and so on. It's sometimes about reducing dependencies in what we probably would never have called strategic areas before the crisis, but we have to rethink this concept. Because can we say that pharmaceuticals, vaccine is a strategic element? Probably 2 years ago, nobody would have said that. Now we see it is one of our problems right now. We don't produce enough in Europe. We have not innovated enough in Europe. We need to make sure. I don't know what the future will be about. Maybe another pandemic, totally different, maybe another problem. But health, pharmaceuticals, medical area, like that, will be seen, I think, a crucial asset. We have to be less dependent on. I think everyone discovered, in France, it was a big shock, even if it was a reality before the crisis. We discovered that we were not able to produce masks at the beginning. Now we improved, all of us. We were not able to produce paracetamol, something very simple, as simple as that. We discovered that 80% of these very basic sets, products, medical products, were produced in China or in Asia, not in Europe, and that we were not able to react fast for this type of simple productions, not high technologies. Vaccines are, but masks are not. We were not able to. So I think we will have to rethink this sovereignty concept, maybe in a more pragmatic manner, to reduce dependencies. And it's clear that we need also here a European solution, because I doubt very much that France or Italy or Germany will be able, willing, or that it makes any sense to produce all these medical items, just to take this example, alone. We will not have a national sovereignty on this type of elements. Climate will probably be even more sensitive issue after the crisis. we would never have a national Italian, French, German, Spanish answer to this, obviously. So I think we will be in a paradoxical situation when Europe will be criticized for a lot of things. We will have to give a new direction to the projects. And if we are explaining it well, I think people will feel that there is a stronger need, even stronger than before the crisis, for European solutions. Just want to make a final comment. I very much think that the link between sovereignty and solidarity is very close, very tight, or very important, because we see that at every step of this crisis. The mask war, if I may say, the tensions on vaccines today, and the geopolitical dimension of all this, with China helping Russia, proposing now its vaccine and so on. There is geopolitics in all this crisis. And I don't want Europe to be the loser of this geopolitical conflict. And if we want to provide solidarity between us, to be able, because it is Europe's values and I think Europe's interests, to provide solidarity externally to Africa, for instance, regarding this vaccination, to take this example, but others, we need to be more sovereign and stronger. To be very concrete and pragmatic, you are not credible in the Balkans, in Africa, maybe in Latin America tomorrow, as Europeans, if you are not able to provide anything to them. If the Chinese are producing the vaccine or exporting the vaccine, if the Russians are exporting the vaccine, and they are trying at this moment to make coup, to make attempts to prove that they are the ones being in a position of solidarity, in a position of strength and strength. If us Europeans, we are not reducing this dependency, we are not producing more, we are not exporting more, we are not able to provide this solidarity, we will lose. Internally and externally. Internally, we see it today when our friends in Slovakia and Czech Republic are facing, as Italy, Spain, and other countries a year ago faced, in a different manner, in a different moment, are facing a big health crisis, and we are not able to provide doses of vaccine now, and only the Russians and Chinese are able to do it or organizing themselves to do it, we are losing them. And when you're, I mean, just a normal Slovak citizen hit by COVID or hit by COVID in your family now, and you hear that the vaccine is coming from Russia and not from France, Italy, Germany, or Europe, your European feeling is necessarily hit and damaged, and maybe for good. So I think it's very important. We will not succeed to bridge all the gaps now in this crisis, but we have to improve and to prepare not only for the next crisis, but for the next moments we will have to live with, because otherwise Europe will just not be relevant for its citizens. And I'm optimistic and determined. I think it can be relevant. It's what I'm now, even if it's difficult, fighting for this European framework and vaccines very hard, because if we do not succeed in this type of response, solidarity and sovereignty, then we will be very fragile. But we can totally succeed. We can totally achieve these results of both sovereignty and solidarity during the crisis, as we did with the recovery plan, and after preparing for these types of response, more solidarity, response for the youth, international solidarity, more production, I will use this simple word, in Europe, in all the areas we need to be strong in. Thank you.
Bene Ministro, grazie per ora, grazie al Ministro Beaune. Allora adesso le presentiamo i ragazzi che sono in collegamento. Cominciamo da Flavia Cervelli, scrive sullo spiegone nella redazione Europa, si è laureata all'Università di Torino. Flavia, il Ministro Beaune ti ascolta.
Buonasera Ministro. Allora io volevo iniziare dalla tematica ambientale. Volevo chiederle quali iniziative porterà avanti la Francia per conseguire gli obiettivi europei in materia di ambiente. Grazie.
Quelle politiche in materia di ambiente.
Comment?
Quelles initiatives la France prendra?
Ah oui.
Environnement.
Sì, sì, scusi. Buonasera. On the first, maybe obvious, it's important to recall the climate is one of the areas in which the national response for European countries is, I would not say not relevant, because of course there are a lot of things we can do locally or nationally or individually, but of course the European dimension of the climate response is absolutely crucial. And I think it's one of the areas we should probably value it more, in which the EU is, I think, up to this challenge. We are the leading force in the climate, in the fight against climate change. We have the most ambitious objectives. We are always leading in terms of international negotiations. I do think that EU, France was very much involved, President Macron, but I think it was an EU fight preserved the Paris Agreement 4 years ago when President Trump at the time withdrew, and so on and so forth. So first, it's an area of strength for the EU. We now have, I think we have went through 2 steps, very important. Carbon neutrality objective for 2050, which we fought for, Italy and France together, actually, 2 years ago, and we reached a European consensus on that, nearly, with Poland being a bit more cautious, but I think they will move. And now a new upgraded objective for 2030, minus 55 of emissions, CO2 emissions. Now, the big challenge, since we agreed on the big objectives, is to make sure we can reach this high ambition. So what we would have to do at the EU level in the months to come, including during the French presidency of the EU, coming early next year, is to take very concretely, sector by sector, the types of objectives, regulation, reducing plastics, reducing pesticides, having stricter standards for car emissions and so on, to make sure that we are on this credible trajectory towards minus 55, 2030, towards carbon neutrality 2050. I just want to insist on one key initiative that France has been pushing with a few other countries more and more, which is sometimes we call it the carbon tax at the European borders. More technically in Brussels, it's called the carbon adjustment mechanism. Whatever, it's the same idea. It is to make sure that we are not alone in this climate ambition. In concrete terms, when a company from China, Russia, wherever, exports to the EU, when it doesn't have to pay the same carbon price as our producers, we create a balance, we make them pay to make sure that they have the same environmental burden or impact than the EU competitors. It's both a matter of fairness, because it's very difficult to explain to Italian companies, to French companies, especially smaller ones, that they have to do a transformation to pay for their emissions, to reduce them, and that the others, international competitors, are not. I think it's not fair, it's not acceptable. And it's also a matter of efficiency, because Europe, I think, is less than 10% of global CO2 emissions. If we do it ourselves, we will just do 10% of the job. So we need also to encourage through diplomatic discussions, political discussions, others to follow us. This is the famous leading by example of the EU, but it's not sufficient. We need also to make sure, including with these types of mandatory mechanisms, that they are also committed to reducing their emissions to climate fight climate change themselves. So I think it's very important, not only symbolic, very concrete, and very important to put the emphasis on this mechanism. 4 years ago, it was totally crazy. I think President Macron mentioned it in his sovereign speech. There were 1, 2, 3, 4 countries in the EU maximum interested in this mechanism. Now we know that the European Commission made a proposal in the coming months before summer, and exactly yesterday, the European Parliament voted in principle in favor of this mechanism. So lines are moving very quickly, and I hope, if I have to take a concrete target, that next year, during hopefully the French EU presidency, we will have a European results on this climate objective, on this climate achievement. I hope so.
Bene, grazie Ministro, grazie a Flavia. Ottavia Credi, ora, ricercatrice dell'Istituto Affari Internazionali. Ottavia, benvenuta.
Buonasera Ministro, grazie per il suo intervento. Io vorrei chiederle, nel suo saggio pubblicato pochi mesi fa, Europe After Covid, scrive che serve un'Europa potente che non può e non deve subire decisioni prese dall'esterno. Dunque la domanda è: l'autonomia strategica europea e l'esercito europeo sono due concetti indivisibili, o può un'autonomia strategica europea essere implementata senza la creazione di un esercito europeo? Grazie.
Grazie, Davia. I don't think that strategic autonomy should be limited to the military dimension, but of course it's a big part of it and probably a necessary element of any credible strategic autonomy. But it's true that this concept has been usually very much used in the foreign policy defense area. I think it's broader. If you don't have 5G as a standards with your own rules, or ideally your own producers, as we do have actually in the EU, you're not autonomous. I was mentioning also that if you, in a health crisis, produce even very basic products all outside the EU, you have a big problem. You import all of them, you are dependent. You are not in a situation of strategic or whatever the adjective, autonomy. So I think we should broaden it. But just to focus maybe one moment on the idea of European army, President Macron mentioned it as a perspective. To be frank, I don't think that it's something for tomorrow. I don't think there will be a European army just erasing or deleting the Italian army, the French army, the Spanish army, and so on. It's not credible. I don't think we want that in the short run or even medium run. But what we certainly need to make this autonomy credible in the military area at the European level is to have stronger coordination, and beyond coordination, a stronger ability to act together. Militarily speaking, concretely speaking, what France is doing with actually EU partners in different manners in Sahel, in Mali in particular now, I think is a matter of European security. I do understand easily that it's more difficult for, or more or less difficult for different EU countries to go there and so on. And I'm not saying that in 5 years, in the same case, we would have a European army with a European general and no national armies anymore, of course not. But if we analyze the threats together, if we have the same strategic culture and habits of intervening together abroad, preparing together, and understanding together that we need to respond to these common threats in a united, maybe it's too strong, but a coordinated manner at least, with stronger efforts, to be frank, externally from all EU countries. If we don't do that, I think we will make a mistake. We will not be up to the security challenge, and we will not have full strategic autonomy for sure. So it's in this sense that the perspective of a European army or Europeanized armies has been mentioned by President Macron. If I just try to sum up what I think we need in this military or defense component of the strategic autonomy, which again I think is a condition of any credible strategic autonomy, more broadly speaking, it's probably common money, common budget. We have a beginning with a European Defence Fund that has been established now. It's 1 billion per year, so it's not big, but it can trigger or facilitate some common EU projects. We are working with Germany and some with other partners, including Italy, on industrial projects. If they are co-funded by the EU, I think it gives an incentive to coordination and cooperation between countries and industrials in this case. The second element is what I mentioned, strategic culture. I think there's no way you can respond to threats, do external operations together if you don't share the same threats. If we are honest now, the threat of Russia is not perceived the same way in Rome, in Madrid, or in Vilnius, obviously. It's difficult for somebody in Tallinn, which actually is not the best example because Estonia is taking part in Sahel, but let's say in Riga, it's more difficult, and I can understand for obvious reasons, to understand that going to Africa and going to Sahel, going to Mali is a priority for France because of our tradition, our history, and so on. It's quite easy to perceive. And we will never erase here again the national sensitivities, the national differences, but common analysis of threats, I think, is key to create this common responses. And the third element is common forces or common operations. We have examples which are quite successful. We just set up a few months ago what we call the Special Forces Task Force called Takuba in Mali. There are, I think, 10 European countries already taking part. Not a European army, but it's certainly a European force which is helping, contributing to our common security around what we did, France, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus a few months ago in Eastern Mediterranean to protect Greece and to send a signal to Turkey in terms of sovereignty, was, I think, a good example, ad hoc example of common military operations. We have, I think, to develop this, probably not at 27, not realistic, but on ad hoc basis, certainly with as much as possible a common framework to go quickly in this type of operations and to have European money also in support.
Grazie Ministro, grazie Ottavia. Milena Di Nenno sta per laurearsi alla John Carlos University in Affari Internazionali, in economia, si occupa anche dei social media dell'Istituto Affari Internazionali. Benvenuta Milena, a te. Ministro, ti ascolto.
Buonasera Ministro, la mia domanda riguarda l'uguaglianza di genere. Negli ultimi anni l'UE ha adottato una strategia per l'uguaglianza di genere con l'obiettivo di raggiungere un'unione paritaria entro il 2025. Nel 2012 è stata proposta una direttiva europea per fissare al 40% la percentuale minima della presenza femminile all'interno del Consiglio di amministrazione delle società quotate in borsa. Recentemente invece la Commissione europea ha presentato una proposta di una direttiva sulla trasparenza salariale in base alla quale i datori di lavoro con almeno 250 dipendenti dovranno rendere pubbliche le informazioni sul divario di retribuzione. La Francia ha appoggiato favorevolmente queste direttive. Quali iniziative quindi politiche ha implementato la Francia o intende intraprendere per adottare queste direttive europee?
Grazie Milena. As you say, France is supportive of these initiatives, of these directives. If I'm correct, the directive on the percentage of women in boards is blocked for, I think, 8 years now, something like that, nearly a decade. I must say, to be frank, that Germany is not helping us a lot in this area, has been blocking for a long time. It's moving, I think, because in Germany this debate has been growing recently with national legislation introduced to have, it's quite limited, but to have mandatory quotas for women in boards of societies, big firms at this moment, being threshold being lowered progressively. So I think this debate is moving to go straight to the point at the EU level. I do hope again it would be a symbolic achievement, concrete one as well, that before, during the French EU presidency in 2022, we can at last have a result on this directive, because as I say, it's nearly a decade. I think the Commission is ready, which is good, to increase the pressure on these types of reforms for women-men equality with this new initiative on equal pay. So it's more process at this moment, it's a transparency element, but we have developed the same type of tool in France 4 years ago, and it's working quite well. It's putting pressure on companies. It's a kind of name and shame process, which is quite effective, because companies do not want to be targeted as not doing their job in terms of equality. So I'm a strong believer in this type of mechanisms. I strongly believe that there is a case for EU action in this respect, and that the debate has evolved in this direction a few months ago already. So it would be, I think, extremely positive to reach results on this. Just to add one thing, there was an initiative that our delegation the European Parliament pushed for a year ago now, which is called Pact Simone Veil, tribute to Simone Veil, first President of the European Parliament, famous European, French and European politician, which is basically to try first to make full transparency on area by area, how we address hatred online against women, how we address equality in the companies, how we address equality in politics, how we address protection against violences at home and so on. So some elements of the fight for equality between women and men, to see what are the best practices in the different EU countries. For instance, we know that for hatred online, Germany and I think Italy have strong initiatives. France is quite good for this new initiative on equal pay. And we try to say political commitment, but we say once we have this full picture, one by one, we try to take the best standards of the best practice, not only with legislation, but sometimes with EU legislation. And we try to use this best practice and to generalize it across the EU. I think it would be very powerful. And since it was a week of March the 8th, Monday was an International Day for Women's Rights. I think every year, the EU dimension of this action is better seen, better identified, and we want to, including the French presidency, put more energy on having this type of EU regulations and EU legislation.
Grazie. Alice Germano ha conseguito un International Master all'Università di Glasgow ed è autrice attualmente per U-Trend. Benvenuta Alice.
Buonasera, grazie Ministro per essere qui con noi a rispondere alle nostre domande stasera. La mia domanda riguarda le relazioni tra l'Unione Europea e la Russia. In seguito all'arresto di Navalny, 6 membri del Parlamento Europeo e altri politici europei hanno dichiarato che imporre le solite sanzioni alla Russia potrebbe non essere sufficiente e hanno quindi chiesto alla Germania di abbandonare il progetto Nord Stream 2. Ad ogni modo la Germania non sembra essere d'accordo. È possibile che questa disputa interna diventi una controversia più ampia e complicata?
Thank you. So on this, to be clear, because I stated in a sometimes undiplomatic manner, I do think, and not only France has said quite clearly a couple of times in the past that we have, and independently from the Navalny case, the Navalny crisis, that we have a reservation and doubts about this project, because not to be too long or technical, it increases dependency between the EU towards Russia, which I think creates a geopolitical difficulty. That said, we know, but it's also clear public, that there is here a difference between France and Germany, not only France and Germany, because each country has its own view on this project. But Germany, of course, is one of the strongest supporters because it is to a large extent a German business project, also geopolitical German project, because the German authorities think it creates a link with Russia that we need. We don't share exactly this analysis, but it is divisive. So what we say is that, okay, we have reservations and doubts about this project. It's clear, it's not linked to the Navalny case, and not to create division in the EU, let's try to find a common position between France, Germany, and all the others on this in the months to come, if we can still do something, because as you know, to be pragmatic, the project is nearly done, not yet fully done, but nearly done, also with the US, but let's try to find a common EU position, France, Germany, and others, before exposing more divisions and more difficulties in a moment in which it could be used by Russia to weaken us. So I've been as transparent as we can on what we think about this project, but I think it's not the right moment to make it a big divisive issue in the to be frank.
Grazie ancora. Allora, Vladimiro Labate studia all'Università di Torino, anche lui scrive per U-Trend. Vladimiro.
Buonasera, signor Ministro. La Cina nell'ultimo decennio ha abbracciato il multilateralismo attraverso la creazione di diverse istituzioni multilaterali. Nel marzo del 2019 l'Italia ha firmato un Memorandum of Understanding con la Cina sulla via della seta e l'Unione Europea qualche mese fa ha chiuso un accordo sugli investimenti proprio con la Cina. Dato che il presidente Macron ha più volte parlato dell'importanza della cooperazione internazionale, quale approccio bisogna adottare con la Cina? L'Unione dovrebbe sostenere lo sforzo multilaterale della Cina oppure guardarlo con scetticismo?
Grazie. To be frank, I think there is obviously two dimensions in the approach of China regarding multilateralism. They want probably to be part of it because it's part of the strategy to be a global player. And so they want to be part of them, to be active, not only member, but active in WHO. They have a real strategy of influence in this organization, WHO, WTO, and so on. They've fought quite strongly to be members and then influential in these organizations. But of course, there is another dimension, which is a tactical dimension in all this. They want to also use this organization to push their views, sometimes, to be frank, to present themselves as good players of multilateralism, not to be accused of imposing their own interest and so on. So there is a tactical part in this multilateralist approach, multilateral approach from China. We should not be, I think, naive about it. There were differences. I think there are lots reduced now between Italy, France, other EU countries about the behavior towards China. I think it's not a bilateral issue. I think it was broadly a European issue. If we just to go quickly, but if we just look at what happened, what was the situation 5 years ago, let's say, all EU countries, especially the big economies, Italy, France, Germany, the UK at the time, were fighting each other to get as many Chinese investments as they could get, or they could attract. And I think we've been all quite naive, meaning that we were too open and too divided between ourselves as EU member states. I think this moment is gone. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we realize first that we need to have a common strategy towards China, a more balanced and sometimes a more not aggressive but firm strategy towards China, protecting our geographical indications, protecting our industries in some sectors. We have now stronger anti-dumping mechanisms toward China, common EU mechanisms. We have now a mechanism, a new mechanism screening of foreign investments, non-EU foreign investments, especially Chinese, when they come to Europe. And I think we will increase this. The debate we have now in Europe about this project of a EU-China agreement on investment is interesting because I think de facto it rebalances the relation between EU and China. It's another step forward. But now the expectations in the public opinion for matters of values and for matters of just fair trade the expectations are much higher than they were 5 years ago. The Europeans and European governments, I think all over the place, do not want to be kind of soft, too naive or too open, whatever word you want, the same approach towards China. So we should not be naive about what they do in multilateral fora. We should engage with them. I think the good solution is not to avoid discussions and to exclude them from this type of organizations. They are the second biggest world economy now. We cannot just ignore them. But we have to reduce our dependencies here again. We have to be less naive about dumping, about foreign subsidies that they use. I hope this year the European Commission will propose or we will adopt a new legislation to exclude from public markets companies, not only Chinese, but including Chinese ones, non-EU ones, which are highly subsidized by the government because it's not fair competition. So I think this element of fair trade, fair competition, more adamant Europe in the relation with China is a narrative that we need to develop, not only as a narrative, as a set of actions. And I do think that Italy, France, Germany, just to take the three biggest economies in the EU at the moment, are frankly nearly on the same page. There are nuances, obviously, still now, but much better than 1, 2, 5 years ago. And we need to go fast because the US will be more adamant with China. We need to be also part of this game to rethink WTO rules to be more protected against this type of aggressive trade in the year or years to come, because it goes very quickly.
Bene, Alice Palombarani si è laureata qui a Roma all'Università La Sapienza, ora si occupa dell'ufficio stampa dell'Istituto Affari Internazionali. Alice, il Ministro ascolta la tua domanda.
Buonasera. A partire da gennaio 2022 alla Francia spetterà la presidenza del Consiglio dell'Unione Europea. Considerando l'arrivo di importanti testi legislativi quali il Green Deal, il Digital Markets Act e il Digital Services Act, quali saranno le priorità e i temi che porterete avanti? Inoltre, la Francia ha istituito un comitato di sorveglianza e un comitato di riflessione. Si è parlato anche di un comitato culturale. Quale sarà il loro ruolo? Grazie.
Thank you very much. And I could do how should I say, a long presentation of legislation and priorities we will push during this presidency, but I just want to focus on a few concrete examples to illustrate what we want to achieve. Always difficult to know if we will be able to achieve it. We will be trying to accelerate and to succeed in. The digital dimension that you mentioned will be a strong part, I think, because it's a priority, but also because we have now proposals on the table, on the EU table by the Commission, which are very important, what we call DSA, DMA, basically new competition rules, new responsibility of big digital platforms for the contents they publish and they spread. I think this is needed. There can be here a European model of regulation for the digital world. If we can achieve a result, political agreement on these texts and these reforms during the presidency, I think it would be very good. The climate dimension that you referred to is crucial as well. I mentioned in the previous questions this border adjustment tax. I think it's very important. If we can, let's be optimistic and determined here again, find an agreement during the French presidency, I would be very happy. I think there is a social rights and the social dimension which should not be underestimated. I mentioned solidarity in my initial words. I think post-crisis, it will be very important. The Portuguese presidency now is putting a lot of energy on this, defining rights, for instance, rights for platform workers, digital platform workers, people delivering meals and so on all over the place now during the crisis. They worked very hard, they have no social protection guaranteed at the EU level. I think defining a common set of social rights for them, for instance, to be very concrete, would be a big achievement. Or there is a project to have minimum requirements regarding minimum wages in the EU. I think it would be a big step forward to adopt also this legislation. I could mention external dimension of our action, probably a new relationship with the UK regarding security and defense and so on. But I just want to take these three examples. And just to add something, that I think the final point you mentioned regarding culture, we want also to have not only this cultural committee, which is about finding events to illustrate the EU presidency in France in particular, as much as possible in other EU capitals, to make it a nice and collective moment. But more deeply, I think we would like, and we are still thinking of concrete proposals, concrete elements to underline during this presidency, of course 6 months is short, to use this opportunity to highlight the fact that there is a European culture. We don't need to invent it. We don't need to produce it out of nowhere. I think if we just look at, of course, our patrimony, creation now, digital creation, which is very lively in Europe, we can prove that there is a sense of belonging. It's not only Erasmus and so on, even if it's part of it. That links Europeans together, especially young Europeans together. Nobody, as Delors said, nobody falls in love with a single market, nobody falls in love with a directive, even a useful one. But you can be linked to Europe if you do Erasmus, if as an apprentice you go abroad as well, if as an adult, you can have in your professional life some help, contribution, financing by the EU, and so we need to illustrate all this and to try to find some symbolic projects. We are working on this. It's a bit too early to say during this presidency. I'm a strong believer in this because without this sense of belonging, there's no way EU can be seen as I said before, relevant or just alive for people.
Bene, Daniel Peronel, corrispondente da Parigi per U-Trend. Lo abbiamo in collegamento. Daniel.
Buonasera, sottosegretario. Ha appena parlato degli investimenti cinesi in Europa. La mia domanda riguarda gli investimenti. La Francia è diventato quest'anno, ma credo già l'anno scorso, il primo paese europeo ad attrarre investimenti diretti dall'estero, prima di Germania e prima del Regno Unito, quando anche faceva parte dell'Unione Europea. In Italia spesso abbiamo l'impressione che la Francia protegga in maniera molto forte i propri settori strategici e le proprie imprese dall'estero. Ecco, la mia domanda è come potrebbe spiegare la strategia francese e per caso può danneggiare sul lungo termine una coesione economica europea, questa difesa degli interessi? Grazie per la risposta.
To be frank, I think there is quite often this perception in Italy, in particular, of France being protective in some markets, very active in growth. It has been true probably in some occasions, to be frank. I think overall, it's not the case. When you look at, I mean, we are of course fighting to be as attractive as we can. I think there's an element, of course, here of competition, internal competition, which we can fully endorse and accept as long as it is not creating, I think, excessive competition or tension. Just take one example, Brexit. Financial places all across Europe, Frankfurt, Paris, Dublin, Amsterdam, Milan, others are in competition to say, okay, the EU jobs, the UK jobs, sorry, which are leaving London to some extent to be in the EU, we prefer to have them in our own capital or in our own city or in our own country, which is legitimate. As long as it is this type, I would say, of fair competition, fine. If it's about creating national regulations to attract financial business and do kind of financial dumping in Paris in comparison with Frankfurt, I think it would be crazy, and we need to keep a set of the rules. So this is the margin I see for internal competition. Just to take France and Italy, because I know sometimes it's a controversial issue. If I'm correct, don't have the figures with me, but if I'm correct, Italy is the third foreign investor in France, so we cannot say that it's a one-way street, and it can be probably improved. There are probably sometimes specific cases in which it's still not fully balanced, okay? But I think overall, we are, not in France and Italy, but in the single market, the main investments usually are coming from another EU country. So this competition is a two-way street, I think is overall fair. And the idea of a closed market that France has embodied over time, I think it is not really anymore the strong reality or the hard facts today.
Bene, Ministro, l'ultima domanda. No, abbiamo Letizia Storchi, redazione Europa dello Spiegone, si è laureata all'Università di Torino. Letizia.
Buonasera signor Ministro. Rimanendo in tema di investimenti, la Francia quanto ha intenzione di destinare del Recovery Fund alle politiche giovanili e in che misura? Grazie.
To be frank, it's difficult to say because I hope that a lot of policies or actions which are not labeled young people policy will help. When you take climate, is it a policy for young people? I hope to a large extent because it's preparing a kind of greener economy and society for tomorrow. So I would not be able, to be frank, to identify the exact share of young youth-targeted policies, but there are some very concrete elements, just to take a few a few illustrations in which it's, I think, in the short run, directly directed towards younger people, young generation. We have a plan called Un jeune, une solution, so a solution for each young person, to translate roughly. It's 6 billion, if I'm correct. It is both an emergency and recovery measure, part of the recovery plan, in which we dedicate money to say to each person, roughly under 25, either you have an internship or you have a training, or you are in university, or you have a first job, and the government is subsidizing for the moment as a part of the cost of this solution. So this is typically, I think, a good, strong young policy for the young generation. It's 6%, just this one, just this measure of the recovery plan. But if you add up some other elements, I hope you will get the maturity of the actions directed more or less directly towards the young generation. So it's how we design it at the moment.
Bene, allora Ministro, siamo andati un po' lunghi, facciamo un saluto solo Veronica Travisani che le chiede qualcosa di cui ha già risposto. Veronica, porta pazienza, siamo andati un po' lunghi e chiudiamo. E ti ringrazio. Invece abbiamo Francesco Tabarrini, l'ultima domanda, è studente dell'Università La Sapienza e le chiederà qualcosa sul Presidente Macron.
Buonasera a tutti, buonasera Ministro e grazie della disponibilità. Ministro, sono passati poco più di 3 anni e mezzo dal famoso discorso del Presidente Macron all'Università alla Sorbona del 2017 e a cui lei, come è noto, ha contribuito in maniera importante nella stesura. Dunque, quello che volevo chiederle è quanto di quel discorso è ancora attuabile oggi e se quella visione di Europa è ancora raggiungibile. Grazie.
Grazie. There are two ways to see it, I think. You can take, I think we made a list of the measures, proposals that were made in the Sorbonne speech, and I think it was around 60. And every 6 months, we look at the boxes we can tick to see whether it's done, nearly done, not at all, and so on. And of course, there is always bias in this, to be frank, or an element of being subjective. But majority of these measures, more than 30, I don't have the final countdown, is done, reached. Just for instance, there was a proposal about a reform or an EU regulation for copyright to protect creation. There was an element of digital regulation. There was some proposal for digital regulation, for defense, creating a common intervention initiative. We tick the boxes and we think it's done or well advanced, I would say. But to be frank, I think it's not the, and to go to answer your question, I think more of this can be reached, I hope, until the French presidency of the EU. Ideally, it will be 100%. It will never be 100%. Or even some measures, when they are not done exactly with the same ambition or in the same way we would have loved to see them implemented. But that's because it was proposals, it was French proposals. It was not the European consensus, and you have to negotiate, you have to find a compromise, and of course, it's fully normal. So I think day one, when the president pronounced the Sorbonne speech, he knew de facto that it's a set of proposals and it will never be 100%. But just to finish on this, because I think it's important, what you were nice to say I contributed to this, the thing I would be most proud of after 5 years of action would be to think credibly that the software, if I may say, or the DNA of the European Union has changed towards this idea of sovereignty. What I was describing in our shift towards China, in our shift towards strategic autonomy, military action, towards reducing our dependencies, maybe not now, but tomorrow in the health sector and so on. I think it's an element of seeing us as more autonomous, more sovereign, more powerful. as Europeans, as a club, as a political project, which the EU is about. If this is not a list of boxes you can tick, this is of course a bit more subjective, a bit more qualitative. But if I have this feeling personally, and if we see this, I would think that this speech has been useful, and I would think that this speech has delivered. Not all, but everything delivered and had a useful impact. And I hope this is already the case, and I hope it will be more the case in a year, when at least in France we would look at what has been achieved when we have this EU presidency and when we have the next elections in our country.
Bene, abbiamo terminato, ringraziamo i nostri ragazzi che ha seguito il nostro evento, l'ambasciatore Cristian sempre per l'ospitalità e tutto il team dell'ambasciata di Francia che ha permesso questo evento. Ovviamente mille grazie a Clément Beaune, segretario di Stato presso il Ministero dell'Europa e degli Affari Esteri, incaricato degli Affari Europei, per aver dedicato un'ora all'Istituto Affari Internazionali. Grazie, buona permanenza in Italia.
Grazie, buona serata.